Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. All right. So, do we need to reread the beginning to refresh our memories, or we want to just jump down to where we left off?
Well, I'm fine because I just read it.
Oh, okay.
Kellyanne.
Good. All right. So,
Go ahead and jump on ahead.
all right, let's do that. So, can you uh, scroll down, Kim?
Where do you want to go to?
Let's see.
Well, we read this. He will sit next to me when I am on my throne.
Right.
I remember that.
Keep going.
You talked about the flood, Noah's flood.
Noah's flood, right? Yes.
Oops, next story. Come back.
Okay. You know what? I think maybe we did read the entire story, but didn't discuss the entire story. So I think is the situation. Um, so let's. I scroll? Yeah.
Just a second.
Yeah. So I think.
Okay, your boss.
Oh, thank you. Such an honor. I think we need to pick up at the paragraph at the end, which begins, the Rebbe concluded by saying, and we did talk about uh, the fellow sitting next to the king on the throne, bringing him into the court. So why don't, Kellen, why don't you read the last paragraph? The Rebbe concluded by saying.
The Rebbe concluded by saying, there is a tradition that before the Messiah will come, there will be a flood. There will not be a flood of water, but of heresy that will cover the tallest mountains. Even in the land of Israel, where the waters of Noah's flood did not directly fall, the rain waters will splash into it due to the force of the downpour. In other words, heresy will splash even into kosher hearts, and there will be no way to protect oneself from it. Even all the royal ministers will scatter, and the very kingdom will shake. Only simple Jews who recite psalms with simplicity will survive, and when the Messiah will appear, they will be the ones to place the royal crown on his head.
Okay. Now, this seems very simple, but it's really not. Let's begin by discussing what sort of flood the Rebbe is referring to.
Well, it's heresy. It's not water.
But it's and now it's connected in some way to water. It's a flood, but of heresy. How would a flood of heresy be different from a flood of water? And why would it occur to the Rebbe to make some sort of association between a flood and well, of water and heresy? What could the connection be?
Well, I've been taught by my somewhat woo-woo friends that life will be wonderful ultimately, and that's what this says as well. But before it becomes wonderful, the bad guys or the heresy will do one last strong effort to retain their hold, their grip on the world, on the minds of the world. And so there's going to be, I can't help but equate it to now here in the United States.
I was just wondering.
There's going to be this huge effort to say, no, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to have a flood. We're not going to change. This is truth, which isn't truth. And that's, so I'm hoping that what my woo-woo friends said is
may
true.
not be so woo-woo. Your rabbi thinks the same thing.
Okay, good. That I don't know.
Yeah, well, but I want to point out some a little bit more complicated aspects to that, okay? So, in general, in the Torah, water is a symbol that stands for Torah, as in the Mayim Chayim, the living waters, okay? And so it would seem to be counterintuitive to talk about a flood of heresy. A flood of waters should be a good thing, flood of Torah. And yet,
Sure.
floods are complicated and problematic images, starting with the flood of Noah, which is, after all, a flood that destroys the world, but which also makes it possible for the world to become regenerated. So there's a kind of double edge here that is interesting to keep in mind. And one thing I wanted to point out is it's just a little feature, but the flood doesn't actually affect Israel directly. It kind of, Israel gets a splash, but other places not so much. And I guess the reason I find that kind of humorous is there are lots of ways in which Judaism understands Israel to be special, Israel, the land of Israel, to be special in a variety of ways. It's the Holy Land, and it's not the Holy Land by accident. It is, the rabbis have this idea. Not only is it holy because holy things are meant to take place there, and there's the temple there, and so on and so forth, but the land itself, the earth itself is holy, which is an idea that's kind of a little, well, within Judaism, a little woo-woo. Why? When somebody dies, there is a tradition that you include in the grave a little pouch or some other kind of container of earth that comes from the land of Israel. Anybody know why that's done? If Israel has a special status, the resurrection of the dead, which is part of, from some points of view, the redemption of the world, is going to begin in the land of Israel first. So you put some of the land of Israel in the grave so that whoever is buried there will be among the first to be resurrected.
Maybe I should tell my friend in Israel to send me a little batch of soil for the coming event.
We'll do that. If you have, if you're working with somebody who is a traditional Orthodox rabbi, that's exactly what they do.
Uh-huh.
And they get a little bag of earth. It's a little cachet or something, and it gets sent, and it's put into the grave during the burial service. So
I was thinking additionally on the comparison between knowledge or between heresy and water. The Torah is kind of like the base of all knowledge and wisdom, and heresy stems from lies. If we can't tell what the truth is anymore, kind of like how we currently can't tell what real news is anymore, that it does seem like if you're simple, that maybe you wouldn't truly be affected by it. You're no longer searching for truth. You're no longer searching for necessarily knowledge.
You're putting us on a very helpful track, Kelman. Here's what I have in mind in response to your comment. There is an ironic what I'm saying, understanding, and it's not really understanding of Torah, which twists it into something which it is not, and which is not true, and which is not what God intends. Okay, there is a misuse of Torah. Now Shakespeare says the devil can cite scripture to his own purpose, and that's kind of what I have in mind. And I think, unfortunately, if you look around the Jewish community today, or more broadly, if you look at the Western religious traditions, you will find plenty of examples of the twisting of the biblical text into all sorts of pretzel-like contortions, which undermine the essential humanity of the text. So, you can, how should I put it? There's a saying that the rabbis have, that the Torah was given to humankind so that we would be able to live. It help us to live, not. And if it doesn't help us to live, it's the wrong interpretation. Basically, that's what the rabbis have to say. So, if you are interpreting scripture, interpreting Torah, and it creates problems for people who get condemned, or they get marginalized or whatever because of your interpretation of Torah, then there's something wrong with your interpretation. It's the strictures, the laws, the mitzvot are supposed to be helpful. They're supposed to support meaningfulness in life. So this image of a flood of water, which is compared then to a flood of heresy, is a pointing out of and condemnation of this often convoluted but incorrect way of understanding what Torah means. So it's the ironic situation in which we might say that the misuse of Torah, or the simple-minded use of Torah, that is to not out of simple or direct kind of faith, but of literacy, a literal understanding of the Torah, or some kind of convoluted way of understanding Torah. That is what heresy is. So, in a way, heresy is classically the misuse of Torah. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Absolutely. I mean, I think ultimately most cults that have existed have based their lie and their religion, or not a religion, but their cult's ethos around an existing religion. They've picked very specific verses, either from, say, the Christian Bible or the Torah, and they only take those three verses to essentially say, well, God said it. He said this. And, that can be, if that's the only thing you ever get is two sentences out of this whole book, there's such a bigger picture that's being missed.
I think that's absolutely to the point. And I'll tell you a little practical rabbinics that supports this. When I was the Hillel director at UT, there were often itinerant pastors who would show up on the West Mall, which is a free speech area at the University of Texas. So as long as you had a small group, only need 3 students to register with the university, you could reserve the West Mall. And these itinerant preachers would come in and they would give these very long, very passionate and very seductive sermons, supporting their own literalist view of the Bible, a very conservative view of the Bible. And sometimes students would come to me and say, "This guy really knows the Bible." And I said, "Here's how you find out whether or not this person really knows the Bible. They quote a text, and you say, I would be interested to know what is the verse right before that one, and what is the verse that's right after that one. Can you tell me what those are?" Because they don't know. They are just taught from a list of verses, and these are the ones that you're going to use, and this is what they mean, but they really don't know the text, but they give the impression that they know the text, and they trade on that with, in this case it was students, but it could be other people. You think that they really know something, but it's not so. That was a little trick that I would teach my students in order so they would not feel somehow intimidated by such a person, because otherwise it'd be easy for them to think, well, I don't know anything, and this person obviously knows the whole Bible, right? So this is a good example of how we see people using the Torah or scripture in general as a way of seducing people into error. Now, I don't want you to I'm putting it that way. I'm using error in the sense that
I think it's the intention in which you're misleading somebody.
Yeah.
It's one thing that you might be teaching the verse exactly as it exists and as written in the Bible, but when you create your own spin and interpretation of it for the purpose of, say, excluding people, hurting somebody, or only liking certain groups, that's where we get a lot of the problems that we have, I think, today in our society. I even think this stems into our country's political of like, where did we go with our Constitution, during the Civil War and during slavery, where man specifically meant white men. So they're the only ones who had rights. So we could enslave people who weren't white.
Well, there are all sorts of reasons why I would agree with everything you're saying. I would also say,
I understand it's a much more complicated issue than just that simple statement.
In some ways, it's very simple, and I'm not disagreeing with you. But all I wanted to point out is, and this is something that I have pointed out often with regard to the biblical texts that I teach in my Torah study class. The Torah is a literarily complicated, complex document. And one of the ways in which it is complex is that the language is used in such a way that it forces you to ask the next question, okay? And the next question is always the one that moves us forward in an inclusive or broadening sort of way. So the text says men, and somebody says, well, what about women? That's the next question. And then somebody says, well, women, what about transgendered women? I mean, you see how it works.
On and on and on and on.
Yeah.
Dogs and cats.
It is, well, not yes, maybe, but you know, one of my
Intelligent animals.
well, you know, one of my biggest mistakes as a rabbi, I made plenty, uh, had to do with a sign I saw up in front of one of those churches, a university, not you, which one? University, something other church on Guadalupe on the drag, and they were celebrating um, an event for the blessing of animals, and it was in celebration of uh, St. Francis of Assisi's birthday.
Mhm.
St. Francis of Assisi, as you probably know, was a big animal advocate. No, it's true. I mean, that was part of his history. And I put out an email, one of the stupidest things I ever did. Uh, and I said, what a strange idea it is that we're going to reserve a special time to bless the animals. Come on. And you should have heard the response I got for having said something along those lines. It was one of the few times in my rabbinate that I had to just crawl away under a rock.
Well,
Okay.
I think just about a month ago, didn't we have a blessing at Beth Israel?
Yes, but I'm going to tell you
St. Francis?
that Herman Cohen or some of the other founders of Reform Judaism are probably turning over in their grave. This is one of the things that has happened in the development of reform, which is what's supposed to happen in reform, but which they would have thought was irrational and nonsensical. Okay, when I was at HUC in New York, one of our theology or philosophy professors was a fellow named Samuel Atlas, who was a brilliant man, been classically trained in the Central and Eastern European yeshivot. And he was, by the time I got to be a student of his, he was in his 80s, I suppose. And it happened that there was this great what is it, a brownout? There was the electricity in New York went off, and we were in darkness, and people were stuck in elevators, and so all sorts of things. So it happened that Samuel Atlas, who was this classical rationalist philosopher, and Eugene Borowitz, my teacher, who was an existentialist and a lover of Martin Buber, happened to be trapped in the HEC elevator at that very time.
Oh my goodness.
All right. So, wait a minute, that's not quite right. Borowitz came up to Atlas when Atlas was able finally to exit the elevator. He said, so, Dr. Atlas, you were in the elevator for a long time. What did you do while you were there? And how did you use your time? He said, I was thinking, you know. And Borowitz said, well, so did you stand up the whole time? Did you decide to sit down? And Atlas said, how could I sit down? There wasn't a chair. Now, the idea that you would sit on the floor didn't even come into his mind. Okay, now if you sit in a chair. That's the rationalist approach. Okay, I always thought this was one of the funniest things that ever happened when I was at HEC, because it was a perfect example of how a philosophy or theology shapes how we see what our possibilities are. for Dr. Atlas, there was no possibility of sitting down and easing his 80-year-old body into a more comfortable place because there was no chair. And the point I'm making by mentioning this, or at least I'm trying to make, is that there are ways in which we limit our interpretation of Torah that get in the way of being able to live by the Torah and not, adopt certain strictures which don't work to increase the pleasure or the holiness or what have you of life, but which we feel bound and limited by because they seem to be the only logical possibility. So, and Atlas was, by the way, a very nice man and very smart guy. I had a fellow student in that class I took with Atlas, who was Andrew Baker, and of course I'm Kerry Baker, and so he took roll every day we had class, and there was Baker A and Baker K. I have a very soft spot in my heart for Dr. Atlas. So here we are looking at a text, whether it's the Constitution or the Torah, and part of the text is this complexity that drives us into new areas, into answering questions that challenge the easy interpretation of Scripture. So all of a sudden, some smart person somewhere, or hundreds or thousands of smart people somewhere, start asking the question, well, if the text says X, how does it apply to Y? Now all of a sudden, the text has expanded, but not because you have imposed something on the text, but you have allowed the text to speak more broadly out of itself. That broadening or that expansion was always there. It was not interpreted onto the text. It was allowing the text, so to speak, to blossom. Okay? And I mention this because we're dealing with, in this story by Rabbi Nachman, the question is, what does Torah mean? Is it possible that Torah can lead to heresy? And the answer is, yeah, it is possible. If you prevent the Torah from speaking in this evolving and broadening sort of way, in this increasingly inclusive way, then yeah, that the Torah as you are understanding it is limited, and not only limited, but it, in a sense, perverts the function or the purpose of the text.
So that could have easily happened yesterday. Yesterday we read about the Israelites coming into Canaan and dispossessing all the people and so forth. But
Right.
it could be you could read it as a permission to do ethnic cleansing, for example.
You could read it that
And
way.
that would be heresy in your view.
Well, I think so, because I
Yeah.
think we have the choice about whether or not we're going to accept that interpretation or another interpretation, which also grows out of the text. So without going into chapter and verse, so to speak, that's the point I was trying to make yesterday in trying to explicate how the text doesn't necessarily have to be read as a negative or limiting sort of way.
What seems interesting to me to what you're saying is that one is interpretation and the other is what the text is saying at another level.
I think that's a good way to put it.
And I think that's hard to defend. Like,
Well, look,
I'm not saying you're wrong. I like what you're saying. I just think it would be hard to argue that, that this is this and this is this.
Well, all I'm saying is that there is this principle that the rabbis enunciate that Torah should help us to live life better. Its purpose is not to make life more difficult or more limited. It is meant to open things up. So we can have a whole bunch of interpretations. Some of them might fail the rabbinic understanding because they result in a closing off or a disappointing kind of view of the world that makes life more difficult, less meaningful, et cetera, et cetera.
So we can tell with this test, does it create community? Does it create harm? Those kinds of things.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
From Rabbi's point of view, that's one way of saying, is this a legitimate reading of Torah?
I think additionally, as Jews, it's our responsibility to ask ourselves, what was the writer's intended message?
Oh, but we've been asking ourselves that since the Torah was put down on parchment.
Of course. I mean, but there's for each Jew a different opinion, So
sometimes more than one.
True.
Yeah, that's the famous line in Fiddler on the Roof, which is actually taken from Shalom Aleichem. This little group that meets every day over old copies of the newspaper. They finally, the news reaches their little village, and one guy says, "Well, this is this," and the other guys, and Tevye says, "You're right," and some other guy says, "No, this is that," and Tevye says, "You're right," and the third person says, "Well, Tevye, if this person is right, and if that person is right, how can that possibly be?" And Tevye says, "You know what? You're right too." That's the point. It moves. The text is bigger than our understanding of the text at any one particular time. This is always my classic definition of idolatry. That when you have an image of God, whether it's a verbal image or a pictorial image or whatever, even a philosophical definition of God, if you think that that's all that God is, you are committing idolatry. That image, whether it's in words or stone or whatever, has replaced God. God has been eclipsed by your own definition. And the more you insist that God could only be what's in that definition, the more guilty you are of twisting, limiting who or what God is. You have to ask yourself the question, all right, so if that's the case, who's boss? Who's in control of what the text means? Us little human beings, or God, who after all gave the text from a symbolic point of view. To say that the text is more than what our understanding is at the time, to me seems to be the correct position. And to say that it's limited by our particular understanding at any moment in time is to be guilty of placing our understanding of the Torah above the complex message that Torah is to us. It's God is, how to put it? God is always one step more complicated than we are.
Oh, I like that.
Okay. And I don't think you can go the other direction and say that our understanding is equivalent to God, because then God is not God. I mean, God is more complex than we human beings are.
There's a nice Buddhist saying that really applies here. Not knowing is most intimate.
Oh, all right. That's a good example. It's a very good example. And yeah, the idea that you recognize that there is a gap, a gulf, a discontinuity between what we understand and what we know, and what God is essential to understanding who we are and who God is.
And you've mentioned that, you know, when you say to your wife, I know what you're thinking.
Yeah. Oh,
It's the same deal, isn't it?
it is the same deal. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And, although, you know, the punishment for that is more immediate.
Does Linda beat you up?
We should not go down that road.
Okay.
But I will say that as a Buberian, as a student of Gene Borowitz, who I just mentioned, Alav Shalom, his point, one of his most important points, was that in the I-it relationship and the I-thou relationship, what's important is the hyphen.
The relationship.
Yes. If you're talking about an relationship, it's not like it is the case in some other forms of religious mysticism, where the idea is for the human being to become merged with the Godhead, so that the individual personality, history, et cetera, of the person becomes absorbed in the God. His point was, and I think it's a good interpretation for Buber, is that it is always about the relationship, and therefore God and human beings are not equivalent. They are in relationship, but they are not the same, which is why that in general, although there are exceptions, trust me about this, but generally speaking, Jewish mysticism is not about losing yourself in the consciousness of the deity. Now, there are forms of Jewish mysticism where that is the point, because, you know, there were Jews, and when there are two Jews, there are three opinions, and that's probably the most basic truth about Jews. But speaking broadly, the idea is that we are in relationship to God, and our consciousness, our understanding, our minds, our spirits, our souls, whatever, are not meant to disappear. They retain a kind of independent, not self-sufficient, but self-standing, integrative kind of existence, which is, you know, it sounds like it's a simple idea, but it's not. This is why this passage we just read in this story by Rabbi Nachman ends by saying what? Who gets to put the crown on the king's head?
Well, the one who's least opinionated, the simple.
But what does he mean by simple? He doesn't mean simple-minded. What does he mean by simple?
A person who is not bound by attitudes and
I guess I wonder if it also is implying the person who does not think they're more complex than God. There's a desire to put God in a box so we can understand him and think that he's this one note king character in a fairy tale story.
I would agree with you, Kelly, and I think both you and Judith made the point, although different ways, that I'm trying to bring out from the story. It's the simplicity here. The simple person is somebody who is in a relationship with God and who does not twist and turn that relationship in order to make it conform into some with some pre-existing idea or their own personal little spiritual hobby horse, whatever that might happen to be, but to be in a direct relationship. And here's the thing, again, speaking as a Buberian, what we understand about the I-thou relationship is there is a kind of direct immediacy to that relationship, which is beyond words. It's beyond definition. It's beyond some kind of simple categorization. So you can't speak it. And Buber is very clear that once you try to explain what the I-thou relationship is, you're already destroyed the I-thou relationship.
because you can't pin it down.
You can't do that. Just trying to explain it put you outside that relationship and back in the world of I-it. Okay?
There's a nice line from, I think, from Emily Dickinson. Never pain to tell thy love, love that told ne'er can be.
Yeah, I think that's along the same lines. I agree.
But it seems like we're talking about the simple one wouldn't have heresy. Heresy would be having answers.
Heresy would be having answers which one insists upon to the exclusion of other possibilities.
Good.
It's not having answers at all. I think it's about the misuse of the answers that occur to us. It's we think when we have understood the text completely, what we are saying is that God speaks in a voice that is simple enough for us to understand and contains no complication or additional possibilities. Now, the rabbis talk about this in a different way. God, according to them, God speaks in the language of human beings, which you think might mean, so it's very simple and direct. No, human language is complicated. Human language is about shades of meaning and nuance and all sorts of things that we might or might not catch at any particular moment that someone is speaking to us or addressing us in some way or another. And we, there are all sorts of ways in which this comes about in sort of comical ways. When you think about the experience that we have all had, where we have some sort of machloket, some kind of controversy with somebody that we're in relationship with. We're arguing with them at a party or something, and we go home and we think, that's what I should have said.
Yeah.
Okay. What is that about? What it's about is you realize the point that was there, which you could have said something about, but you didn't see it at the time. It was there all along, but somehow you didn't latch onto it in that moment. And human language is like that. There are meanings, there are shades of meanings, there are misuses of words that turn out to be, in the end, very helpful. I mean, all of those things exist simultaneously. So to say that God speaks to us in the language of human beings might lead us to think that it's very simple. Okay, there's a simple meaning that the text says, and that's what it means. But that's not how human language works. So there's, I don't know, I'm not going to be able to say this right because I don't like it, but it's something like God said it, so I do it. Well, somebody help me. It's about it's a kind of simple-minded justification for a literal understanding of the biblical text. God said it, I believe it, and that's it. Something like that. Well, I think a lot of people do think that way. But every time we come across that, from my point of view, we are dealing with an inauthentic view of how God communicates or speaks with us. God's message is always, because God is always, at least one step more complicated than we are. And because of that, it's interesting to study the Torah year after year after year, because each year we discover things that were there all along, but which we didn't see.
But we're different each year, and that's why we discover. It seems to me that creating a definition of God, let us say God is blue. So you walk into a paint store, which blue is God?
Very good. Very important distinction. The word blue is a good example of a word that seems to be simple and direct, but really is not. It's full of complications. For example, God is blue. Does that mean God is sad?
Maybe.
I'm feeling blue. There are all sorts of possibilities. And when we define one or another of these possibilities as being incorrect or wrong-headed or off the point, we're saying that these possibilities are beyond the power or the personality, so to speak, of God. We are limiting God, which is what I am saying is the idolatry that results from assuming that what we know about God's sayings or language or God's commandments or what have you is the end all and be all of what God is. So getting back to that last part of the paragraph, I think I want to make sure that I've made this point. I'm not sure that I have.
I guess I feel where heresy comes in is when you say God is blue, specifically he's rhythm blue, and it's because he's sad.
Well,
where we are presenting these interpretations that are ultimately interpretations and opinions as fact. That is heresy.
Well, if we say that the interpretation that we have come up with is the only interpretation.
Yeah.
There aren't other possibilities that we are exactly doing that, Kelly. And this is why
Agreed.
this simple person at the end of the story, not simple-minded, but simple as in direct, those are the people who are entitled to put the crown on God's head. Their simplicity, that is to say, their directness of their relationship with God, without excluding and monkey shines and whatever, they are the ones who, by doing things that way, are crowning God. That, I think, is probably the best way I can put it. It's not that they have some kind of special status. It's that they have moved beyond the twisted limitations that all of us are tempted to have in trying to understand not just who God is, but any idea that is more complicated than our own minds. And there's a special term for that when that phenomenon is something that takes place in the realm of theology and in the realm of understanding who God is. That's what we call idolatry. But we do it in other ways as well. And we have been going through a period now in our country where that's been happening with the Constitution. The Constitution, it is, in a way, Holy Writ, but it's not exactly Holy Writ. But, we just had a new Supreme Court justice.
It's 1 o'clock.
Yeah, we gotta stop. Who wants to get back to the original meaning of the text. I think this idea is laughable. It is absolutely laughable because people are going to argue about what was the original meaning.
Yeah, women couldn't vote. So I guess that means that we should take away the votes of all women.
You see, that's why this gets to be so patently misunderstood, in my view. Okay, but you're talking to a Reform rabbi, and I suppose not. There are other kinds of rabbis who might look at it differently. But all right, we should end here for today, and we're going to do a different story for next week. It's called what's it called? Well, it's at 366, right near this one. Hang on, I will tell you. If you want to read it in advance, you might want to.
Oh, Verda is next.
Yeah, but that's not it.
And then 366 is bitter herbs.
Bitter, that's the one.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll do herbs next time. Thank you all very much. Have a good
Shabbat shalom.
Yes, same to you. And I'll talk to you next week.